And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We have a very exciting episode today. We have on Jean-François Gariépy. I know I didn't pronounce that right. He also known as JF. JF is a Canadian neuroscientist and a controversial political commentator. He's known for his discussions and debates on various social political topics, especially on his YouTube channel. This is a bio I got from ChatGPT. I think they did a pretty good job. Can you tell us how to actually pronounce your name the French Canadian way?
My name is Jean-François Gariépy, but people call me JF on the internet.
Awesome. JF, great to have you. So today we're going to have a discussion on the Jewish question. For those who are unfamiliar with the Jewish question, it's a term that actually was popularized in the 1800s in Europe. It's what do we do with the Jews? How do we integrate them into society? This was also a term used by Nazis to also, what do we do with the Jews within society? Do we deport them? Do we kill them? Do we integrate them? The Nazis decided killing them was in their best interest. Other nations are having similar, not other nations, but people amongst other nations are having similar conversations. What do we do with the Jews? So, that's what we're going to talk about. This is an episode that very well may get demonetized and potentially even a strike against the YouTube channel. So we're going to try to not use words that are too inflammatory, but we will see. And we'll also take some audience questions. So, JF, it's great to have you on. So what, you're not too big a fan of the Jews?
Well, thanks for inviting me. We had a good debate last time, and my crowd liked you. They liked that you were at times fair, at times showing yourself to be fairer than a lot of the leftists or the pro-Israelis that we had interacted with before. As far as I'm concerned, the Jewish question in modern times relates to four different dimensions. And to me, first and foremost, is the realization, are Jews different? Are the Jews that live in America experiencing existence fundamentally differently from Christians or descendants of Christians? Because I like the term descendants of Christian and descendants of Jews, because at this point, there is much secularism going on, and a lot of the Jews are not into Judaism as a religion, but they are still ethnically Jewish. And to me, the first question, the first dimension on which this question matters is there a difference? And can we talk about it? To the question, is there a difference? I believe there is a massive difference in the experience of a Jew talking about politics in the US right now versus a Christian. I believe, among other things, there is a massive fear that is instigated in young Jews as they get raised in either Jewish schools or Jewish families, a fundamental fear that the place where they live is not forever, that the place where they live will eventually turn against them, which initiates almost every young Jew gets initiated to some form of anti-whiteism in Western civilization, which places them as an enemy of the majority in their head many times. Uh, so that's a first difference, which fundamentally will lead their reactions politically to be different. I don't know if you've had that experience of an education that tells you the majority eventually will be dangerous to you, Adar.
Are you asking? No, me personally, I was not raised. I was not raised with that, and nor do I
Okay.
actually think most Jews are raised with that teaching. I think that I think that Jews are often taught about their history, which can give them a mistrust in being a minority, amongst a majority that's different from them. History has proven that is not in their best interest in many instances. So I think there's a collective trauma that's involved. But I don't think it's like drilled in our minds from a young age. I think it's really
Well,
a result of our
you
history.
say that there is trauma. So this trauma is what I characterize as being what's drilled early in your ages, and it is drilled among other things through Holocaust training and education.
But yeah, but we need to also very much understand that. And I actually have a similar. I say something similar when I'm debating Israelis about they're like, Palestinians are taught to hate Jews. I'm like, and I respond, I said, even if they aren't taught to hate Jews, their real life experience is just going to just reinforces their teachings. They don't need the education for their experience to lead them to certain conclusions. So the best way to help Jews overcome their trauma and not feel like they can't be safe is to stop hating Jews, right? It's almost like nothing fuels this fear more than the anti-Semites.
I disagree. I disagree. I think that we have to look at a point in time. The Jewish community will have to grow from traumatizing children as a method of education and switch to a more civilized mode of education. At one point, you're going to have to ask yourself if perpetually educating your descendants into a mentality of victimization has not, to a certain extent, played against you and has not led you to have fears that are unjustified and fears that keep putting you back into a historical cycle in which you come to do a social preemptive strikes against what you perceive to be a menace, but what really isn't. It's only through the lens of the history and mythology that you tell your children that you come to feel that hate. Uh, Consider
Well,
the alternative. For example, in a non-Jewish situation, um, there is a lot of hate against white people out there, but we make it a way of educating children not to feel victimized in the white community. You could reach a similar point in the Jewish community where you don't constantly recycle this historical event upon which your identity is based.
so I want to make a little bit of a distinction here. I think there's some segment of the Jewish population that it's very much there's like a theological belief that will always be in conflict with the nations, right? Now, this is not this is a minority of American Jews. The majority of American Jews are secular, many of whom are atheists. What they're learning is very much it's not realistic to say don't tell your children about what happened to their grandparents, right? We're just a few generations from the Holocaust. So, for example, I wasn't raised a victim in any way, shape, or form, but I know that my grandmother was taken away from her family at the age of 4, and her entire family she never saw again, aside from her mom and her sister. But her father, her brothers, her uncles, gone, never to be seen again. I wasn't taught that I need to live my life in fear, but this is very much a part of my upbringing because it's my grandmother's experience. And this is true for most Jews. They have family members who are affected. So it's very natural for this to be part of our upbringing. It's not like there's something innately malicious about it or comes from a bad intent. I think we learn about we learn about the history of our people. What that results in, I think there's an interesting conversation here. I think in the United States, primarily, there's being a victim has really become popular, right? There's nothing gives you more social legitimacy than being victimized. And the more victimized you are, the more legitimacy you have. And in fact, today in modern politics, Jews are not considered oppressed, and they don't get nearly as many victim points as if you're a person of color, if you're trans, if you're a woman. These are the primary victim categories. But I do agree that there is on both sides, whether you're Jewish or whether you subscribe to like what is known to be woke social justice, there very much is this like emphasis on being a victim because culturally and socially it seems to give you more credibility and more legitimacy. I just don't really see this much of a Jewish issue as much as like a woke politics and the culture they're bringing forth and the incentives they put behind being a victim. And I think just one more note on Jewish victimhood. I think Jews are interesting because I don't deny that there's certainly too much victim mentality in the Jewish community. I speak to my Jewish friends about this, but we're also to the point where we're not victims to the point where it's disempowering, right? Because Jews are highly successful. So even with like some of the fear that we may have, it's not like we're very much not in the opinion of we are hopeless. There's nothing we could do. The state needs to come in and save us. It's very much, okay, we might not be able to trust the nation we live in, but we know that we have the means to rise up and accomplish great things in life. So I think that one of my greatest concerns with victim mentality is that it truly is disempowering for those who believe they're victims. And I think actually in the instance of Jews with their victim mentality, it's less disempowering for them than it is for other groups. But this speaks to the grievances of anti-Semites. It's that they don't trust the nation. So what does it mean? And I think we're really getting here to the crux of where a lot of this anti-Jewish sentiment comes from. You have this small population who are highly overrepresented in industries of influence, whether it's media, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's finance, whether it's politics. So what does it mean when you have this small ethnic group that's overrepresented in positions of influence who may not support the state to the same extent as the average individual? And I feel like this is really maybe the most important topic we could have on the topic. But
It's very important, but I wouldn't want this topic to be misled from the start. It is important, but it is not formulated properly, because the Jews have had no problem using the state in the US. The Jews who control academia have not had any problem getting funding from the state for scientific projects. The Jews that control the military to protect Israeli interests in the Middle East have had no problem using the American state to lead wars in the Middle East. So I don't think the question is properly framed. It's not so much that these power elites are scared and do not trust the state. It's that they're all over the state and they are controlling much of its fate to the point where it is detrimental from the perspective of the host nations. That is, to me, the second point of the Jewish question, which is the having an intelligentsia and an intellectual elite that deep down inside do not feel that they have skin in the game, in the demographics constitution of the country in which they live in. It has a big issue, which is that our ideological systems will be driven toward bad decision making from our perspective, but decision making that is advantageous to the people who push it, which is the Jewish people. Just one example: Ben Shapiro, being a public thinker, saying, "I don't mind about the browning of America." That is exactly what you get when you have an intelligentsia whose demographic constitution is so internal and so mundane and elitist that Ben Shapiro himself is 100% genetically Jewish. And yet he's there telling white people, "I don't care if you're getting browned out by a demographic dilution through migration." There you have the double standard, that where the Jewish elites controlling the thoughts and controlling the public discourse becomes a problem.
Yeah, so I don't really see Jews controlling discourse. I think they have influence over it. And again, here's where I think we're going to be in agreement, because Jews are overrepresented in many industries of influence. You could say they have a disproportional say over these matters. And then we could have a conversation of, should any group have a disproportionate say? Um, and I think that's a legitimate conversation to have. But to reach the conclusion that Jews sometimes somehow have this control over the conversation, they determine politics and they determine the conversation. I think it's attributing way too much power to all too small a group. So if we want to say they have disproportionate power, I would agree with you. If we want to say they have total control, I think it's really it's looking at things a bit
Well, I
too.
haven't said total control.
Well, you
Control
said
is a
that
continuous variable.
you
There
said they
is such a thing
determine the
as partial
conversation.
control. There is such a thing as partial control. Now, I don't care about the semantic debate here. We can talk about disproportionate influence, but to influence is to control. If you can influence one way or another, you control the outcome of the system one way or another.
But it's interesting because a lot of it really comes down to how you parse the categories. So is it Jews that have the disproportionate control, or is it people who are wealthy?
Well, Jews are overrepresented in positions of influence,
But
among other places in the media. Now,
right,
the
right. But
media
the
works
common
on wealth.
denominator,
What?
the common denominator in the United States amongst those who have disproportionate power is not religion, it's not ethnicity, it's actually cash money. So it's almost like if we want to get to the bottom of how we stop individuals from having too much disproportionate control, you don't need to splice it on ethnic lines. You need to splice it on socioeconomic lines, and that's how you could create a more just system. That how much
Those
money
are
I'm paying.
overlapping things. It is also through monetary power that Jews have reached their greater influence over politics by constituting something like more than 70% of the large top 10 donors of both parties. So it's not because it's true money that there's not an ethnic component to it. As far as I'm concerned, the relevance of the ethnic category boils down to this question: do I have more insight in the world when I interpret a media as being Jewish, a commentary as being coming from a Jewish author? Do I understand the world better with this category or not? It doesn't matter that this category overlaps with other categories such as wealth. The ethnic question remains.
Okay, so I'd say let's talk actual examples if that's the case. So you brought up something interesting about Ben Shapiro. Um, I'm actually surprised by that quote because Ben Shapiro, being a conservative and considering most immigrants are not conservative, I don't see why he would be okay with the browning of the country because, like, just based on political demographics, it it doesn't seem like something he would support. But if we look at Jews in power, their beliefs are generally aligned with the side of the political spectrum they are on most topics. So if you want to understand how a Jew is going to behave in power, you need to know which political party they're registered to, and based on that, you could actually quite accurately predict a lot of their beliefs, which is true amongst all Americans. So I'm not sure that them being Jewish actually tells you a whole lot about what they're going to believe. And I'd be happy to hear concrete examples from you, but I'm pretty sure most things that you could attribute to Judaism, I think, could very easily just be attributed to elitism. It's how elitists act in positions of power. If you talk about like the overwhelming support for Israel, I would say that has something to do with Jewish donors and AIPAC, but I think it probably has a lot more to do with the fact that Israel is in the U.S. sphere of influence and they view them as a important ally for having geopolitical control over the Middle East. And regardless of if you had Jewish support or not, the military-industrial complex alone is enough to ensure that there's unwavering support for Israel. The same way you have unwavering support for Saudi Arabia. It's not as vocal, right? You don't have politicians speaking pro-Saudi Arabia to nearly the same extent that you have them speaking that way about Israel. But when push comes to shove, the support Saudi Arabia gets, or Egypt gets, or Jordan gets, all these countries that are in the U.S. sphere of influence, they get pretty much blind support from the U.S. because there's other things at play than not only other things, but more powerful things at play than Jews and whatever influence they have over politics.
Well, you do a form of ideological slipping, and it's the second time you do it, so I want to call it out. You come with an alternative category, and you say, how is that not better than the Jewish category?" It's a little bit as if I was to show you a parking lot. There would be 10 cars and 10 pickup trucks. And the 10 cars happen to be yellow, and the 10 pickup trucks happen to be purple. And I was to state, look, there's a bunch of pickup trucks and cars. And you come to me and you say, well, why do you distinguish between pickup trucks and car at all? I'd rather distinguish between yellow and purple, since they are all yellow on one side and all purple on the other. It's not because an alternative category like elitism could be made up and perhaps have some predictive power that it removes the ethnic component. I recognize the signature of the ethnic component of a Jewish intellectual because I've been habituated to see them divert on specific blind spots that have annoyed me for years before I came to understand, all right, you just have to admit it. that Jews think differently. They see themselves differently in the world. One of the examples is Sam Harris, who I would follow on almost every rational statement of his until he would come to something like the Muslim question and start justifying preemptive strikes against Muslim nations. And then I would suddenly understand, how is it that I can follow a man and agree with him on so much? And then when it reaches an enemy of the Jewish people who they perceive as a threat, suddenly Sam Harris goes totally in a different way. And he goes totally irrational also on Trump. He's been said to be a stellar exemplar of the Trump derangement syndrome. And I had to come to the conclusion that, yeah, the fact that these philosophers are Jewish explains the difference in sentiment, in
So,
their political positioning.
so I'd be happy to talk about examples. And by the way, some people point out that my tongue is blue. I take this nootropic it makes my mouth blue. I haven't been sucking on lollipops. It's a nootropic that has methylene blue, nicotine, caffeine, and CBD. It gives me a little edge.
Mhm.
Yeah, if in case anybody's wondering, maybe one day they'll sponsor the show. So Sam Harris, let's talk about Sam Harris, and then I do want to hear some more other examples. Sam Harris's political views, how much of it is influenced by his Judaism? Hard to say. I mean, he grew up secular and he's an atheist, so he considers Judaism to be a made up religion, right? So he's ethnically half Jewish. His political views, I think he's actually a pretty free thinker, so I don't think he falls into one category. But if you look at his views on attacking Middle Eastern countries, he would very much just fall into the category of a neoliberal. And that's not a Jewish category. That's a political category where you have Christians who fall into that category and have very similar political views. Neoliberals also happen to be very anti-Trump. So I don't see how him being Jewish actually explains his behavior. It's the
Well,
fact that he aligns with neoliberal politics more than anything.
amazingly, what you call neoliberal politics has been essentially a set of geopolitical interventions that have benefited the state of Israel for the last 20 years. It's basically a Jewish program. It doesn't matter that you convinced 150 million Christians to defend Israel. It's still an idea that fundamentally is not at the advantage of American Christians and truly benefits Jews. So that is where the category Jewish, and you did it again. You say, oh well, it's a political category. It's not Judaism. I've never said that when I call the Jewish people, I never said that it's about their religious beliefs. I'm talking about the ethnically Jewish people, including all of these secularists like Sam Harris, who somehow come to unite on certain issues that clearly can be said to be in line with Israeli interests.
Yeah, but just because something is in line with Israeli interest does not mean that that is the only reason why somebody would support that. The geopolitical considerations of the United States are far broader than what's good for Israel, and a lot of it is really to keep this war machine oiled and profitable. The invasion of Iraq, that is, you can make the case that was good for Israel. You can make the case it's bad for Israel. There's no clear benefit, but it was great for the war profiteers. Excellent for the war profiteers. Toppling of Gaddafi in Libya. That wasn't for Israel. That had other geopolitical considerations. Trying to topple Assad. Again, Assad is not within the U.S. sphere of influence, so of course the U.S. is going to want to topple Assad, and they supported the rebels on the ground to do so. So this is all neoliberal politics that is not directly related to Israel or done for the sake of Israel. I think it's not really looking at things accurately. So when I
completely disagree with everything you just stated.
so
Benjamin
real quick,
Netanyahu requested himself the intervention in Iraq. He was in front of Congress saying, please invade Saddam.
Bibi wanted that for sure, but it's not like Bibi gets to be the arbiter of truth of what's good for Israel or not. If anything, he's done.
Doesn't matter. He asked for it and he got it. That's my whole point. You keep talking about the intention of the Jewish people as if it's something that exists. All that exists really is there is certain Jews who have specific influences and they use it in a way that is disadvantageous to the American white population.
You think the United States invaded Iraq because of Bibi Netanyahu?
He is definitely among the causes.
So was it him or was it the executives, at different military contractors that would get billions of dollars, or the shareholders, or their lobbying power? These people have a lot more influence over U.S. politics, and you could look at it in terms of how much money is spent on lobbying. The war profiteers, you want to call it the defense industry, that's gonna, if you really want to understand U.S. foreign policy, you're going to get a much better understanding, a more accurate picture if you look at it through the lens of the military-industrial complex and not through the lens of Zionism.
You claim this, but you haven't demonstrated it. And you haven't even demonstrated that these war profiteers aren't Jewish. And so as far as I'm concerned, I remain with my Zionist-centered view, because I know the facts of the Zionist-centered view. Now, we should look into those companies and see if those CEOs are Jewish, and I'd be curious to look into it.
You could look. Some are, most aren't. Most of the executives at the different companies aren't. Most of the shareholders aren't, unless they're, BlackRock is very Jewish, so some of them are owned by BlackRock. But to say I haven't demonstrated it, the claim you're making is Bibi said invade Iraq, therefore we know that is why the United States invaded Iraq. But there's no reason to think that Bibi can have so much influence over another country. When what I'm proposing, I'm saying, look, actually, you want to say, look at the money, look at the people who spend the most money in U.S. politics, which lobbies have the most power, what are their interests, and then when you look at the actual result of U.S. policy in the Middle East, I think it's not hard to reach the conclusion that there's something, there's powers at work that are more powerful than the Jewish lobby and have more influence than the Jewish lobby. Now, the case could be made that they have similar interests, right? That what is good for the war profiteers is good for Israel, so therefore they are aligned. I think one can make that case. But to think that whatever the U.S. does in the Middle East is because of Israel just doesn't seem to be really grounded in reality. And when I talk about categories, when I say let's look at it in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of ethnicity, I have two reasons for doing this. Okay, one is I always want to use the more accurate category. So if there's an instance where the Jewish category is the most accurate in order to understand something, then I would say it's okay to use it. So part of it comes from accuracy, but the other part actually is we have a tendency to generalize people in groups, right? All forms of group hate is really seeing the behaviors of some in a group or experiencing some members in a group, and then we have a tendency to attribute that to a whole. So I think that the more we move away from categories that isolate certain racial, ethnic, religious groups in a way that is negative, I think the better off we're going to be, because the more a group is hated, it's just negative for that group, but it also increases the pride in that group. So one of the things that fuels Jewish pride, and I'm not going to say this is the only thing, but one of the things that fuels Jewish pride is anti-Semitism. The same way we still have, the reason we have pride parades today is because, the gay community are historically oppressed. If there was never any issue with homophobia and it was fine for forever, there wouldn't be a pride parade, there wouldn't be need. So pride of a people is enhanced by hate of that group, which to me creates, just more division in society, groups viewing themselves as differently. So that's why I'm careful with how I categorize. I want what's most accurate and actually what's most helpful to building a cohesive society. So I'm okay with having there be a Jewish category, but there needs to be a really strong case that it is an essential category, and I'm just not seeing it, at least not in terms of foreign policy. Can we actually look at examples? How are Jews politically different than the average American? So you have 70% of Jews vote Democrat, right? How are Jewish Democrats different politically than Christian Democrats? What issue do they differ from them on? I'm not sure there is one. Now we could look at Jewish Republicans and compare them with Christian Republicans. How do they differ? And here there might be some interesting things. I would say, because why? Over the majority of Americans, both on the left and the right, support Israel. Those numbers are higher amongst the Jewish population. It shouldn't be hard to understand why. But if you, aside from Israel, how are they different? So on the Republican side,
this is fascinating. You keep trying to swipe away the most important part of the conversation. Why do you do this? Yes, leftist Jews differ from the anti-war Jews who will sing songs about Gaza in support of Gaza. But yes, the Jews differ on this, and it's so important because 20 years of American geopolitical policy has been centered against Palestinians and Muslim population and for Jewish populations in the Middle East.
So if you look, you think there's any issue acknowledging that Jews in the United States support Israel at a higher rate than non-Jews? I mean, that shouldn't be controversial, right? That's like we could agree on that. I just from there to reach the conclusion that U.S. foreign policy or U.S. support for Israel is because of those Jews when there's a lot of other factors at play. That's why I just don't think it's an accurate explanation of what is actually going on. So the largest voter base in the United States that supports Israel are evangelical Christians. They have,
again, it's a whataboutism.
No, it's
okay.
No,
you subverted America successfully, and you convinced the Christians of your side's position.
Wait, hold on.
What does that change?
JF, I don't think this is whataboutism. I think, again, if we want to talk about reality for what it is, you and I will be in agreement that U.S. Jews have a higher support of Israel than the average of the nation. Is it higher by much? I'm not sure. The United States is pretty damn pro-Israel. The younger generation is pretty anti-Israel, but the younger generation of Jews is also pretty anti-Israel. Again, I don't know the numbers, but we will be in agreement that there is going to be a discrepancy in support for Israel if you look at Jews compared to non-Jews. No disagreement there. Where we're in disagreement is how much that actually influences the state of politics. And I don't think it actually changes all too much in terms of policy. I think it might change something in terms of lip service. So let me just give, and I mentioned this earlier. The United States has certain countries that they're going to blindly support because there's these certain geopolitical concerns or considerations, right? Whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel, the U.S. is going to support their allies for these reasons. Where Jewish influence can make a difference is in lip service. So if you talk to American politicians, they'll be super pro-Israel in a way that's weird. Like in a way that I agree, you could be like, why are all these politicians so pro-Israel? Like, why are they no longer loyal to the United States? Do they care? Like Nikki Haley, a clear example, how she seems to be like, she should be the prime minister of Israel.
Israel first.
Yeah, exactly. So I hear this. I can understand why this would be of concern, and I would actually go on to say that I think that this lip service that we hear publicly is actually a result of Jewish constituents and Jewish donors. I think there's probably that's a fair conclusion to reach. I don't think, though, it has so much influence over policy, because I think policy has much deeper and broader considerations than just like one group and how they vote and how they donate. I think it's more complicated than that. So it's not whataboutism. It's really trying to have a more whole picture of what's actually going on. And one that, by the way, doesn't inflame people against ethnic groups. Again, if we can describe reality in a way that's both accurate and not harmful towards any group, I think that's probably the preferred way to describe reality.
And I want to go on this comment because it reminds me of a statement of Eric Weinstein, which in my view illustrates perfectly the inability of the Jewish intelligentsia ultimately to guide white people forward into the future. And it's almost what you said, but Eric Weinstein made it even clearer. It's this whole, we should lie about race. If we can lie about race, if we can get away with it, there are some truths that we shouldn't pursue. And unfortunately, when you take that stance, which Eric Weinstein has been taking, and you're kind of taking, but in a softer way, when you say, if we can avoid that category, let's do it.
But and be accurate, and be accurate. So that's not the same as lying. I would never suggest we lie about a topic.
Well, the problem is you can be super accurate and yet avoid mentioning something. And just by avoiding it, you are kind of lying. You are doing a lie by omission. And right now, under the guidance of a Jewish intelligentsia that believes it is the right way to behave, we are in the US implementing an absolute taboo on discussions of race facts. And that discussion is being shut down largely by Jews, by companies that control speech that are headed by Jewish CEOs, by departments of truth and safety at Twitter, for example, in the old management that were headed by a homosexual Jew in Joel Roth, and that decide we will not talk about these facts. Not only will we not talk about these facts voluntarily, we will actually ban and force people not to talk about them. And that is fundamentally disadvantageous to the one race that would benefit from these race facts, which is white people. That is the consciousness of white people that they are a group, that they are a group that is headed toward a minority status in the US, and that they have their own political interests that differ from those of the Jews and the blacks, is an essential reality that we need to communicate to people, but that we can't on the modern internet. Thanks in most part to Jewish contributors to the censorship systems of the internet.
Yeah, so I would say I would also agree with you that there are certain powerful people who are working to censor, and because Jews are overrepresented in positions of power, it's quite possible that Jews are overrepresented in the energy that goes behind censorship. Again, it's important to understand this does not this reflects only amongst the Jews that are in those positions of power. But the question is, how does their Judaism get them to differ from what they want to censor? Now, you're making the claim that the reason why we can't talk about race realism is because of Jews. I would actually say, if you actually look at the Jews that are actually Jewish supremacists, which they certainly exist, primarily in the ultra-Orthodox community, they're also race realists. I don't think they like the conversation of Judaism and how they're different, because we look at all the Jewish achievements and it's often concluded that that is a result of superior intelligence. So I don't think Jews don't have something to benefit from race realism. I think Jews are often, some of them not only push it, but I think they can benefit potentially even more than whites if we want to look at, IQ studies. I think that the reason why there's censorship around race realism is because we don't really know how to build a beautiful, cohesive society while being accurate about differences in races. I think it really opens up Pandora's box to very ugly racism. So people in positions of power are scared of what that actually looks like. Race realism is one of the most challenging conversations to have, because I am one that believes that there are genetic differences between races, but I also believe that that doesn't tell you anything about the individual, right? And I think ultimately the best way to build a beautiful, cohesive society is to not look at the group, but look at the individual. So I think it doesn't matter if one group is on average smarter than the other. You can meet an individual from any group and they might be much smarter than you.
It's incorrect. An average tells you a probability, and that probability is readily convertible into individual measures. I can say,
if you were to have to guess, but you don't have to guess. You should just get to know people.
You do have to guess. Everything is a guess in society. When I get a new employee, I have to guess if he's going to make me lose 1 week training him and then disappear, or if he's going to smoke crack on the job, or if he's going to do the job. Everything is a guess. When I date a woman, I have to guess if she's going to be loyal or if she's going to disappear in 6 months. Everything is a probabilistic guess, Adar.
Yeah, that happened to you, right? Can we talk about that? Because you just right, your girlfriend disappeared, and people think that you killed her. Is that the story?
Oh yeah, well the Jewish press claims that I killed
Okay,
her, but or
it's
they try to entertain a rumor that I killed her, which is ridiculous. My girlfriend just went away, so
okay. Well,
that's just what happened.
well, I believe proven until innocent until proven otherwise. So you deserve the benefit of the doubt, and I'm sorry she's gone.
You're one of the good Jews.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's back up. We got a little off topic with this suspected murder, but you should not hire somebody based on the race they're from. And actually, this is something that Sam Harris says as well, right? About there might be different average distribution, but the range is so broad that knowing somebody's race does not tell you enough to reach a conclusion.
It tells you enough. It tells you enough to make better behavior. That's why IQ tests at employment had to be made illegal. They had to be made illegal because they were useful.
If you're going to hire somebody and your metric is race, then you're just a bad employer. You should interview them. You should see their achievements. You should understand their values. Through a conversation, you could also identify intelligence and emotional intelligence and make a conclusion based on that. If somebody's just looking at someone's race, then they are literally putting themselves at a disadvantage because they're not using a more accurate determiner of somebody's qualities.
You're the one who claims that you have a better individual measure than race, but you haven't made that demonstration. I'd be fascinated at seeing a study that actually pits out your talent as an interviewer versus just basic bigotry and see who wins.
So you think if there were two employers, one would go purely based on race, the other would actually do a thorough interview and get to know each individual. You think the person making these guesses based on race would make better hiring decisions?
I have actually never seen scientific data of any kind that tells me that human resource ladies know what the fuck they're doing in even winning a percentage edge based versus random employment. And so yes, I would tend to think that a measure like race and it's tied to IQ, for example, may very well outperform these human resource ladies.
And wouldn't IQ outperform race?
I don't know. I don't know about this because I don't think that IQ captures enough. I think that race tends to capture more than IQ.
Okay, so IQ is one of the things you think that race determines, and the other would be like culture, for example?
I wouldn't say that race determines, but it is tied to it. And there are things that are not properly captured by an IQ test. An IQ test measures your cognition as you're performing an engaged task. But whether you are, for example, a loyal employee over 6 months might not be super measurable through an IQ test, but might very well be better measured by a race.
Okay, but
assessment.
Is it?
Is it? Well, unfortunately, we don't have much data on this, but I wouldn't be surprised that it is. Unfortunately, we're not even allowed because of people like you who say it's too ugly to look into these questions.
Well, so let me make it clear. I'm not saying it's too ugly to look in these questions. I just understand the social repercussions of certain conversations, and I could understand why people would be concerned over having conversations that they think would be net negative for society. And let me just give you another example. I don't want to open up a whole new can of worms, but for example, I don't believe humans have free will, right? I don't think we're actually have the level of agency people think we do. I think we could do what we will, but we can't will what we will. So whatever. I don't want to get too much in it, but in short, I don't think we have free will. Do I think that we should teach this in school because we'd be better off? No, I think it's actually the illusion of free will and believing that we have agency is so important to a functioning society that I wouldn't suggest that we teach people that we don't have free will, because I think it's not, truth is important, but also the outcome it has in society is important. So I can understand why there's concerns as to onto what conversation is important to have and what are the potential repercussions of certain conversations. So,
This is a very Jewish belief, and this is what I came here to criticize. Because I came here
what's the
with
Jewish
in
belief?
mind the statement of Eric Weinstein, but I find out that you are ultimately putting truth below your Jewish preferences, and that is the problem of the Jewish
Wait.
intelligentsia right
So,
now.
by the way, you know I'm an atheist, okay? First of
Yeah,
all.
but again, I don't have to say it again, Adar. I
No, no.
do not
So what
talk
is my
of the Jewish people as a
what
religious
well,
people.
okay,
They are an
and that's true.
ethnicity. They
That's
are a
true.
people.
I'm 99%. I'm 99.8% Ashkenazi. I'm of the Jewish people without a doubt. So
Yeah.
what is my Jewish belief that you're seeing here?
Your Jewish belief is that you have a better technocratic understanding of what the world should be than what truth could give you. You want
So
to go beyond truth. You want the lie to bring us somewhere else where your Jewish mind think is
hmm,
better.
okay. So if you were to have you seen the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson?
My God, I may have back in the
Okay.
days.
They've had multiple debates, but one of them was on this topic where Sam Harris is way more on the truth is what matters, and
Oh
Jordan.
yes,
Okay, but here's just a clear example where a Christian and a Jew are debating, and the Jew is the Christian's taking what you perceive to be a Jewish position, but what you just described is not a Jewish position. Some people believe that truth is not the most important thing, that giving people meaning, that building a cohesive society is more important than truth. That's not a Jewish belief. That's just a belief
uh,
that some people hold.
I think you're misrepresenting that discussion because I analyzed it word by word in detail on a stream back in the days. It's not that Sam Harris was standing for truth. He was paying lip service to a specific definition of truth against Jordan, who was divagating with an absolutely ridiculous definition of truth. But I would consider Sam Harris as one of the intellectuals who is anti truth, who will tell you that there are certain truths that we should hide in the same way Eric Weinstein would. Here's one truth, for example, that
And you're
we
saying
know
that's
much better.
you're saying that's a Jewish belief.
I believe that the Jews tend more easily toward that belief rather than a true search of the truth. I believe that the Jews are more tendentious, they are more likely to express that idea than a Christian, than a true fundamental Christian, not the average American Christian. I don't care about them. But that is a problem to have an intelligentsia that is actually admitting that its only purpose, because the intelligentsia's only purpose would be to find the truth. And yet they're telling you we will obfuscate the truth on certain subjects. Here's one truth where your consequences in the world becomes kind of blurred and where we can't really discuss about this subject. Interracial dating. Anyone who looks at the data on interracial dating between white women and black men will find that this white woman exposes herself to a higher risk of murder, a higher risk of physical abuse that range in the 5x up to 7x multiplier. That is, you are 7 times more likely to be murdered in a biracial relationship if you're a white woman going to date a black man. You say, let's shut up about this truth. I say, let's teach these truths to young ladies. What
So
are the consequences of your belief versus mine? You are hiding someone, giving them which would give a truth that would give them the opportunity to protect themselves.
I
I want to reveal it to them.
so I would not be against spreading that truth. And in fact, like my views on speech in general is I don't want to stop people from speaking. I do think there should be some, like, there's just so much misinformation that I could see there being some kind of deplatforming for, like, people who are intentionally repeatedly spreading misinformation. I could see a reason for deplatforming people who are inciting violence. Like, I think there are instances, but generally speaking, I don't want to control what people should talk about. And in fact, I think when you silence people, it doesn't stop the conversation, it just moves it to the shadows. I'd rather us have these public conversations because I think that's more productive. Um, so, like, if you ask me, when I mention free will, I don't think there's that's an example of something that's true, but I just don't see any benefit to like teaching it. So again, it's not about censoring it. It's just about what is the benefit. Okay, so don't put in the curriculum. You see some advantage to educating white women that if they marry a black man, that they're 7 times more likely to be killed. I haven't seen the data, but I'll take your word for it. I don't have any issue with that being a conversation. But I would say that people having that conversation should be careful and have it in a way that doesn't try to fan the flames of racism. Because again, I do think our goal should be to build a cohesive society where we ultimately are viewing people as individuals. And I don't think a woman should decide who she marries based on their race. I think a woman should, make a judgment based on the values of the individual. Because again, if you're just deciding based on race, that is going to be less effective than having a good call of character. Same thing with the interviews. So I think trying to make decisions based on race is generally not as accurate as having good judgment and getting to know somebody and making the conclusion based on who that person is.
You make this claim, but again, you don't know. You don't know in real life, in the kind of think of humans as a biological creature in an ecosystem. A woman will cross about, I don't know, if she goes to work physically in a brick and mortar place, she might cross 1,000, 2,000 humans a day. What is her chance of detecting the murderers from the non-murderers? And are there moments in which the only data she will have is race, and in which she could act upon this data?
But
You don't know. You don't know that you have such good
No.
interviewer or dating skills that you could detect that your future wife is a murderer.
Generally speaking, before you decide to marry somebody, you're able to collect more data on them. And look, and it's interesting because often what we decide to focus on is really dependent on the point we're trying to prove. I think if you look at the number of if you look at domestic abuse amongst drinkers and non-drinkers, there's a very good chance that it's more than 7x, right? So one should say we need to teach women not to marry drinkers if they really want to stay safe. Or maybe there's certain professions that also have a higher rate of abuse. Maybe people in blue collar jobs more likely to abuse their wives than people in white collar jobs. There's many different categories you could look at, and you're going to see a difference in domestic abuse. And this is true about any single issue, no matter which group you look at. The group people kind of get stuck on is really dependent on the group that they, for some reason, are focused on, whether they think that group is causing problems or they're scared of that group. And I think I just want to like zoom out a little bit. You have, for you, it seems like based on our conversation, you have some concern with minority groups, from Central and South America coming in. You have some concern amongst the Jews, and also of Black people. That's kind of what I've gotten out of it. But if we look at like how people describe reality, it often is they attribute a very complex system to the behaviors of a group. And I think it's a way to simplify and understand something complicated, but it loses its accuracy. So if you talk to somebody who's woke, they will tell you it's the white man who's causing all the problems, right? Those damn white men. If you talk to somebody who is a socialist, they'll say it's not the white man, it's the capitalists, it's the capitalist system. If you're primarily focused on feminism, you'll say it's the patriarchy. If you're focused on the Jews, you'll reach the conclusion that our problems are a result of Jews. If you're focused on, if you for some reason don't like Black people, then you'll be convinced it's the Black people or the other immigrants. So generally speaking, we attribute the problems we see to the group that happens to be in the forefront of our minds. If you're wearing Jew-tinted glasses, you see the Jew everywhere. You're more sensitive to things they do than what other people do. And I think it gives this skewed view of how things are actually functioning. So I think if you...
can I address this?
Yeah,
I think you're doing some kind of Freudian psychoanalysis, trying to understand what my motivations are. I can tell you.
I'm not speaking. I'm not. Hold on, real quick.
You're talking about my focus, and you're trying to present me as kind of a sick, focused person with an obsession. I have one obsession, Adar, and it is the truth. And let me try to help you to see if we can make that discussion productive. Grant the hypothetical. Suppose there is an information that I have, and I have very little time to gather information about the person. And I have to determine some behavior, maybe if I'm going to cross the street or not cross the street. If there is some information out there that is unavailable for me to investigate in any other way than just trust the probabilistic calc that I can make based on the statistics of race, should I do it if that action is to my advantage? And that's it. There's no other way I can get this info. I don't have time to talk to the person, interview them, marry them. I just have to make a call. They're crossing me on the street, and I have to decide if I'm at likelihood of being knifed right there. Can I act on a race fact in that circumstance?
Yes.
All right, then we agree. And we should be able to discuss these race facts. And inevitably, as we discuss them, there will be people punished unrightfully. There will be people for whom you cross the street and they weren't about to kill you. And so be it, I say.
So yeah, I think, you're giving an example where you don't have an opportunity to get to know somebody better. You need to make a judgment that you feel like could be life or death. The only thing you have, and here's actually the honest truth. It's not, people aren't responding just to race. A lot of it, if you actually think about it, is how that person is dressed. So somebody who might have some kind of fear of black people, if they're walking down the street and, they could pick one side of the road and they see a black person wearing a suit and a tie walking towards them. On the other side of the street, they see a white person who's wearing like baggy clothing. They very well might trust the black person wearing the nice clothing. So I don't think it's not, you can't just isolate it to race. A lot of it has to do with energy, what they're wearing, how they carry themselves. But again, I think people, when you have a decision that you feel like your safety is of concern, then you need to make a decision based on the information you have available to you. And if one of those is race, I'm not gonna, I don't think that there's something wrong with that. I do think, though, in most instances in society, I think there's very few instances where race is the only thing you can know about somebody. So I don't see why that should be an important factor. If you could get to know somebody, and the more you can know about them, the more accurate of a conclusion you could reach. And I think in most instances, you'll see that race doesn't really matter all that much.
I think you will see that it matters a lot.
I think if you correct for socioeconomics, you will see that that is a much more deterministic of certain outcomes.
But you can't correct for socioeconomic even at the individual level. You're talking about a statistical method and trying to bring it at the individual level. What does it look like if I'm trying to marry a black woman and I want to correct for SES? When she says something stupid, I'm gonna say, "Oh well, it's not because she's black; it's because she's poor."
No, if she says something stupid, it's not because she's black or poor; it's because she's stupid. I
have nothing to add.
What is wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong is
that
because you let a single observation deny the probabilistic knowledge that you know from a group. It's as if I was showing you one pickup truck and suddenly you forget that pickup trucks are a category as a whole, and that yes, this pickup truck will look very much like some other pickup truck. And it's not because you can look with a microscope at the pickup truck and see the little differences in its painting that it's not still a pickup truck.
Yeah, it's just I'm not sure if the pickup truck analogy works so well, because even if there's average differences, there's still very large differences within each group that you don't really know where somebody lands on any psychological measurement without actually getting to know them or seeing tests. So again, race is a very shallow, inaccurate way to understand somebody. If you don't have any other information available and you need to make a real-time decision, sure, go for it. most instances in society, that's just not the case. And we have the privilege to get to know people and interview them and make decisions based on their values and their
The
personality. And that's what it
information
is.
that you're talking about is enormous. And I can prove it to you. I can have you make a 100% call based on just one information. Look, I'm looking at my screen right now, browsing through Twitter. There's a social media video, and there's a woman who's on top of a car and she's twerking. She has a fat ass, and the fat ass does boom, boom, boom. What's the race of this woman, Adar?
If I were to have to guess, then, I would make an educated guess based on what I know to be culture. Yeah. But that's not.
Oh, it's culture.
We're not in disagreement. Well, wait, you think twerking is more? You think that's genetic?
Well, it's culture in a certain race. It's the culture of a race. And by the way, culture doesn't make it non-racial. It's not because you learned something from your parents that it's non-racial.
Well,
Among the racial characteristics are things that are learned.
Well, yeah, that's true. The difference and why I think culture is more important than race is because culture can change. So the second we conclude that some races or some ethnic groups are inherently a certain way, then you don't really have the ability to do anything about it. If we could identify something cultural, then I think that we have a legitimate conversation of how do we change problematic aspects in that culture. And we could talk about culture.
It's fascinating because you're bringing me on everything I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to talk about this, the Jewish delusion that genetics is unchangeable and culture is changeable, which is a repeated observation across Jewish intellectuals. They all hope that the Marxist dream is realizable through culture and somehow not nature. There is this false dichotomy of nature versus nurture, the false separation between these two, and the misunderstanding that actually, if something was racial, it would still be changeable. You would just have to farm the race in a different direction, which is what we don't do. Instead, what we do is we assume the changeability of the human brain. We try to teach people against their nature. And as we demonstrate through Chicago schools, for example, totally failing in educating whole generations of youth, the fact is you can't train people above what their nature has set them to be able to understand and comprehend.
I would agree to an extent that there's certainly a limit to that our nature could certainly limit certain things, but I do not think that it's to an extent where you can't have a situation where Chicago schools can be improved over time through different cultural changes. Like to think that to think that there's something in Black DNA that doesn't allow for them to go to school. I don't know. I would say the burden of proof would need to be on the person making that claim.
Well, the burden of proof is on the person who claims that they can change the current outcome. The current outcome is that there are certain schools in Chicago that the level of illiteracy is above 90%, some of it 100%. And so if you have a positive claim to make that you have a magic way of changing the curriculum at Chicago schools, I'd like to hear it.
Well, and let me actually just add to what you said. And what's unfortunate is what we noticed is even if we invest more money into the school system, it actually doesn't change the outcomes all too much, which is unfortunate because, as a liberal, I would like to say we just need better funding, but it seems like there's something beyond the funding. But you bring up Chicago. Are there any districts where you have a similar percentage of Black students with different rates of literacy? And the answer is yes. I think if you look at it, if you look at it on a school district, measure it based on school district, based on state and city, you're going to see differences across the board, which shows that there is something beyond race or beyond genetics that's playing into this. It's socioeconomics, it's your upbringing, it's how much you come from a household that values education.
You don't know these things. The differences
No,
that
no,
you're
wait, wait,
talking
no,
about.
no.
First,
Wait,
I don't deny the differences that you're talking about, but they could very well be due to genetic diversity within the Black population. You assume that they have to be cultural.
yeah, well, there would be a very easy way to prove that though, because then you would, if you could show that for some reason, the and I'd almost rather return to the Jews because I just feel like we have less legitimacy talking about it's become about black people. But let's just finish
The
this point. Then we'll
Jewish
move.
idea that only trans must talk about trans, the
No,
Jews
no.
must talk about the Jews, and the blacks must be there for the
You see
black
that,
discussion.
right, Jeff? But that's your Jew tinted glasses, because that is really that's really that's woke ideology. Some of whom are Jewish, but I happen to be an anti woke liberal, so I'm gonna. In fact, I think wokeness is such a garbage ideology. I'm just as much in opposition to it as I am as those who are very far to the right. I think it's garbage for many ways. We could dedicate a whole hour to talking about why what's become known as woke social justice sucks. But I do think that a lot of it is about perception, and I want the viewers to. I think, well, me specifically, I have more legitimacy talking about Jews than black people. So I'd rather talk about it. But what do I actually think on this? I think every single person has the right to speak on every single issue, and whether you think that person is legitimate should be dependent on the merit of what they're saying, not their identity. So let's just put that out there. In terms of the differences in school districts, it's very easy to check. We know that there's not some, like, if you look at African Americans, right? These are descendants of slaves, so they came from different places in Africa, but then had hundreds of years of intermixing. It's not like those that came from Nigeria are different than those who came from Kenya. They've actually been intermarrying for many years, and they're distributed, I would say, quite randomly throughout the United States. The
I
differences we
disagree.
see that, so you think Chicago has a different type of black person than Detroit? Is that what you're
I
saying?
think it's possible that there would be detectable genetic differences. Yes.
Okay, I mean, this is something that I think is quite easy to prove. I even think ChatGPT could probably give it to you. But why don't you think culture can play such a large role when we see how important it is to human outcome?
I'm not saying culture doesn't play roles or doesn't even play a big role. I'm calling out the false dichotomy here because when you talk about culture, you tend to bring as opposed to race. What you don't seem to understand is that part of the genetic consequences of being part of a race and having the genes of that race may be the type of culture you grow up in. In other words,
Okay.
a child, from the perspective of a child brought up by white parents or black parents, the genes of their parents and the genes of whether this or that gene makes you a better or worse parent, whether it leads you to beat your child or to teach him quantum physics, will differ genetically and culturally, but for ultimately what is a genetic cause.
So you think if we take the same Chicago students and we send them all to private school, they'll still have a 90% illiteracy rate?
I think they will not reach. They might win a few percentage point of performance, but they will not reach close to the average white performance. In fact, we've done these experiments to a certain extent. We've compared race and
Well,
SES, socioeconomic status, and what we found is that SES will boost black performance, but not to a level that closes the gap with white people. Even the richest of blacks do not perform as well as the poorest of whites.
what's this is one of those truths that people really do try to stop people from talking about, because people don't really know how to build a cohesive society with this being something that is widely spoken about and widely discussed. So I certainly understand the resistance here, what the resistance people have, and I would actually say one of the reasons why one of my grievances with wokeness is that they always try to look at differences based on racial lines. And when they do that, they reach the conclusion that it's a result of systemic racism. And then the counter argument to that is like, no, it's just racial differences. So no one actually fuels conversation of on race realism more than the woke, because they force the conversation by looking at group differences and attributing it to something that they don't really have much proof that that's where it comes from. My perspective on this issue is, as I said earlier, I think there seems fair to believe that there's genetic differences between different ethnic groups. I do think, though, that given the right certain upbringing and culture, that a lot of the differences can be narrowed down, and ultimately there's not much value you get to actually looking at the group unless you need to really answer a question about society. So if somebody says, why is it that Jews are, and again, I think I'm going to bring it back to the Jews. Why are Jews overrepresented in positions of power? Is it possible that they, on average, have a higher IQ? Would you say it's possible that's why? Because are you a race realist when it comes to Jews being overrepresented, or is it just why blacks are underrepresented that race realism matters?
I'm a race realist concerning Jews. I consider that the Jews are a race or an ethnic group, however, or a subpopulation, however you want to characterize them. Now, the question of Jewish IQ, I'm open to discussing it. It could be a plausible explanation, but the numbers must make sense. And what I find is I'm not convinced that the Jews have much of a higher IQ. I believe that the studies run on this have been poorly made in a way where the category of Jews was self-selected. And I believe that in self-selection, you end up having the kids from the most well-off families identifying stronger as Jews. And those kids probably overrepresented intelligent kids or intelligent adults eventually as being Jews, whereas the low level Jews that are not from well off family or that may be half Jew or quarter Jew, they don't get included properly in the Jewish category. They end up in the white category, and I believe that they're more likely to have lower IQ. So I think that it's an artifact of poorly run studies that we have this conception that Jewish IQ is on average higher.
But it almost seems like you're a little bit more skeptical on the data of Jewish IQ than you are in the data of Black IQ. Is that because the data is that much different, or is it because,
The data is massively different because with blacks, we have the characterization of the blacks of America, the characterization of the populations they come from in Africa. We have much more data on Black IQ than we have on Jewish IQ. Jewish IQ is a couple of studies, and I challenge the validity of these studies because of the problem of the tightness of self identification. We would need a genetic study combined with an IQ test to really say, okay, genetically, this person is half Jewish. Let's see what's their IQ.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I actually have not, race and IQ has not been an area of much importance to me for the reason that I think that it doesn't really help us solve problems. It helps give us answers into certain societal disputes. So I'm not going to push back on that because I'm really not sure. If I were to have to guess, I would actually say I would guess that Jews on average do have a higher IQ than probably most other groups. And the reason I reached this conclusion is simply based on, I think a lot of the overrepresentation, which is often blamed on coercion or nepotism, I think a lot of it actually just comes down to being like highly educated, highly ambitious, and highly intelligent, and just having an advantage for that regard.
The man who was telling us to judge each individual individually is very quick to use a group umbrella to cover all Jews now that it's about how intelligent they are. Don't you take the time, Adar, to meet every single Jew and interview them?
100%. I would never ever say you should hire somebody because they're Jewish. That's not the position I'm taking. You simply say you're very quick to believe racial IQ studies when it comes to comparing blacks to whites, but when it comes to comparing Jews to whites, then you're a little bit more skeptical. I actually probably think that the studies out there, I think they're probably accurate enough. I just don't think they're extremely important. I don't think they benefit society, and I don't think they really get to the bottom of all too much. I think what it does help us understand is disparity within groups, which is why I don't think that's a good way to look at society, to say, oh, why are white people overrepresented in this? This must be a result of systemic racism. There might be another reason why. But I would never say you should hire a Jew. You should hire a Jew because they're Jewish. No, you should speak to the person, understand them, understand their emotional intelligence, which is not IQ, right? You could have a high IQ and a low EQ. I think most jobs you should actually, personability is in many instances more important than IQ. So yeah, interview the Jew and reach a conclusion. And if you have a black man who is more qualified than the Jew, 100% hire the black man. Hire whoever is more
That
qualified.
would be nice on a pamphlet. Interview the Jew.
Interview the Jew, yeah.
Which is what Joe Rogan does, as demonstrated by Leather Apron Club. Joe Rogan interviews the Jew.
I debunked
and
that.
He does this in a disproportionate manner.
Yeah, why do you think that is? You think Joe Rogan's a hidden Jew? Or is it that Jews are just overrepresented, so there's going to be an overrepresentation on interviews?
I know how interview gathering works, how agents work, how even Nobel Prizes work. And I can tell you that it's all behind the scene conversations in elitist clubs. And I am absolutely certain that among the people who influence who goes on to a Joe Rogan interview, there are Jewish agents close to the Hollywood milieu and who can have contacts with Jewish intellectuals and favor their invitation to Joe Rogan or on Lex Friedman. And this was statistically demonstrated by Leather Apron Club. Shout out.
So you all can watch that. I debunked that video. I don't remember all the claims, but he did it. He was sloppy in his claims. Joe Rogan has an interest to interview the most interesting people. That's his personal interest. Is it possible that Jews on average have better agents and these agents are getting them on Joe Rogan? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so non-Jews get better agents. Agents respond to money. Pay them, they'll get you on. It's not a Jewish thing. What?
Money, agents, networking, everything I've just listed.
Okay, wait. So
we agree.
No. So what you're saying is Jews are better at making money. They're better at networking. So this is what you're saying. The reason Jews do well is because they're just succeeding more in society.
They're better at networking with their own networks.
Let's say on average,
of Jewish preferring ethnocentric billionaire Jews.
So the agents are Jewish, so they're gonna. So are you saying a Jewish agent isn't going to work with a non-Jew, or they're just not going to treat them as well?
They're going to work with them like they will work with a Mel Gibson or these people who end up being actors in Hollywood and are not Jews.
Leather Apron Club, if they really wanted to do a good job, what they need to look at, and there's a level of subjectivity here, so it's not that easy. But what they need to do is they need to take a certain industry. Let's say politics. Take the top 100 most prominent names in politics. What percentage of those names are Jewish? And then compare that to how many Jews, what percentage of political guests on Joe Rogan's podcast are Jewish. If there's a major discrepancy there, then you could say that Joe Rogan or the agents are preferring Jews. But it's quite possible that the rate of Jews that Joe Rogan is interviewing is in line with how they're represented in those industries.
This is amazing because you're taking your fallacious approach of the beginning of this interview and trying to make it into a scientific method. You're saying, what about politics out there? Well, even if the problem of your method here is that if politics was also biased for Jews, you would end up knowing nothing. And in fact, the big problem ultimately is that even if the Jews had hired Christian puppets to represent them in Congress, you wouldn't know from their Christian identity only.
I'm not sure I'm following.
So first, I'm telling you that if you compare the guest of Joe Rogan to the overall political constitution of the U.S., the problem with this approach is that there may be also a Jewish bias in who gets to be in the Congress. So that's the first problem with your method. The second problem is that even if someone identifies as a Christian, you won't know if they are ultimately purchased by Jewish interest and servant ultimately to Jewish interest.
But
like many politicians in the US right now.
But JF, this is a very different conversation. I was simply giving a very, not a quite accurate way to know if Joe Rogan skews is favorable towards Jews in a way that's significantly, statistically significant.
That is the approach of Leather Apron Club, and the answer to the question is yes.
No,
now, whether other fields in the US are also biased, that's a separate question.
That's not true. What Leather Apron Club did was saying that Joe Rogan interviews a disproportionate amount of Jews.
Exactly.
So, correct. But in order to know if Joe Rogan has a bias or if there's a bias in the agency, you need to look at the industry from which he's interviewing people and see how many of the prominent figures in that industry are Jewish. Because, for example, let's say you take all the prominent political journalists and 20% of them are Jewish. That would make them 10x overrepresented in the population. If we see that Joe Rogan, 20% of his political commentators that he's interviewing are Jewish, Joe Rogan is very much in line. All he's doing is picking prominent political commentators who happen to be.
No, you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what Leather Apron Club wanted to do, which is the goal is not to prove Joe Rogan is biased. The goal is to prove the entire system is biased. And it doesn't matter if that bias comes from a higher bias in some other domain.
But that's not what he's proving. All he's proving is that Jews are overrepresented in certain industries, and that's not
exactly.
But no one's debating that. He didn't need to even talk about.
Clearly, someone is debating that because he's getting a lot of pushback. So maybe you're not, but many people are. And by the way, what you just did there, you wouldn't let me do it if I talked about Black people. I couldn't come here and say, oh, well, let's say that a grocery store has refused to employ someone, and that person has a claim that he was discriminated against by racism. And then you look into the grocery store and there's lots of white employees, and you end up looking across all of the grocery stores of the town, and everyone is white. And someone would come and say, okay, this industry is discriminatory. And you could be like, well, no, because that's the average of the industry. If you look across all of the US, everyone is white in grocery stores. Well, you would basically be justifying your discriminatory racism by saying, well, it's the state of thing. It's just how it is. You're saying that's just how it is. The US political system is taken over by Jews.
If you want to reach the conclusion that someone is or isn't getting hired based on discrimination, you need to prove that to be the case. And you can't prove that to be the case based on looking at discrepancies in demographics. I don't think that is an accurate way to look at it. I mean, let's take an example that's quite trivial and not harmful. But, if you look at like Indians and, how many Indian Americans are there? What percentage of the population are they? Hold on, let's just check. What percentage of the Indians is a good harmless one to talk about. Let's see. Okay, they make up 1.3%. Indians make up 1.3% of the U.S. population. If you look at those who own Quickie Marts at gas stations, I think it's probably more than 1.3% Indian. It might even be closer to 20%, right? So Indians, for some reason, are way overrepresented in owning Quickie Marts. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to claim that there's any malice there, that there's any nefarious intent on, going on. I think there's something cultural amongst, you know, Indian Americans that have them gravitate towards that job. You know, that happens. So I'm not going to reach any
No one
conclusions.
is talking about malice. The problem would be, is there a societal consequences that is grave to the fact that Indians have so much power over where you take your gas and where you go take a pee? And perhaps that could be a problem. But in
So
this case, it's not dramatic. In
right.
the case of Jewish intellectualism being overrepresented, it is dramatic as it
Okay.
turns out.
So this is where we started, and I think this is also a good place to end. What is it? So I would agree that I use the Indian example because, again, it's quite harmless. It's just quickie marts. I think that the grievance against Jews, it's easier to understand where it comes from because Jews are overrepresented in positions of influence, and many believe Jews to be different in their values, different in how they see the world. So to them, this gives them reason for concern. I think that is the most, call it, easiest to understand and most charitable representation of the anti-Semitic position, or anti-Jewish position. But let's actually talk about how this different manifests. So support for Israel, we already went through this. We don't have a full agreement here. I think we're in agreement that Jewish influence can affect how politicians speak about Israel. I think when it comes to policy, I think there's way more powerful actors at play. But I do want to, let's talk about some other issues that you think beyond Israel where Jews are different from the norm and that is influencing politics.
The issues of our pursuit of the truth in various domains, like the racial truths I was talking about, the issue of censorship, the issue of FBI intervention in people's lives and FBI overstep over individual rights, the issue of where America is headed demographically and the question of immigration. I believe that if you don't have skin in the game in the Constitution, the demographic Constitution of the US, you are improperly guiding the US forward. And ultimately, the fact that this special position in the intelligentsia that the Jews have been occupying is a moral guide for the country and an improper moral guide that currently is rooting for our own demographic destruction, rooting for our death as military at the service of Israel, and rooting against the presidents who could take us out of this game. People like Donald Trump, who attract a lot of hate from the Jews. I also believe that in the domain of the media, I'm an example of how the Jewish press will just hate you very much, and they will tell lies about you. They will seek false allegations from your exes because they don't like your IDs. As long as we can't have a free marketplace of IDs where the intelligentsia is not selected by Jewish billionaires for what you will hear from the top down, but rather the intelligentsia is self-selected to a process of meritocracy of the merit of their true IDs. As long as we have these hit pieces like those that are written in the Daily Beast about me, painting me first as a rapist years ago when I'm not, now as a murderer when I'm not, the Jewish intelligentsia has a problem of its relationship with the truth when it comes to their own ethnic interest. And if they don't solve it, they will come to be increasingly irrelevant to any truth seeker, and eventually the world will just move away from people who are ready to push lies when it favors them.
So it seems like everything that you mentioned that you feel like Jews are influencing, and I know you're not going to like that I say this, but that is simply liberals, elitist liberals. If you take an elitist liberal Christian, they're going to be on the same exact page as the Jews in those industries pushing for those same things.
Never had a Christian liberal write a hit piece about me. Never.
So, but so here isn't, so this actually, I'm happy you're saying this because it helps me better understand where your worldview comes from, because it's almost like you took it personally because you were attacked by Jews. I think that's actually very natural. I think often our disdain for groups, a lot of it comes down from group experience. So you had the Daily Beast, which is a Jewish-owned publication, come after you, and this has helped you reach the conclusion that there's something about Jews and how they're attacking those they don't like. But it still is an anecdote, and in order for us to make this seem like actually prove it's something Jewish, we need to. And again, someone can study this and reach this conclusion. I'd be interested to see what the result is. But if you look at media that is owned by Jews and compare that to media that is owned by non-Jews, and like, what is the difference with how they report? What is the difference on their hit pieces? Is there a statistical significance between Jews and non-Jews and how they report? I'm not sure you would find it. In fact, I think if you would find that difference, I think it would be a major talking point amongst those who are concerned with the Jewish question. But
Let me know about the results when you run that study. On my side, I'll trust my senses until we have your scientific data.
It's an anecdote based on personal experience. If I was, let's say, walking down the street and I was mugged by a white guy, and therefore I think white people are now, the most violent people in society, like, cool. But
it's not a single event. There are repeatedly Jewish authors have been writing hit pieces about me. And I'll trust my senses.
Hold on.
And I've seen them write hit pieces about other people who just happen to want to talk about race or talk about nationalism.
So
that really triggers the Jews. Until you show me scientifically, I'm very enthusiastic about gathering scientific evidence about this, but I won't do it because I know how to observe with my senses, and I've gathered enough data in my life to believe that Jews have something with nationalism that triggers them.
You're saying Jews in general don't like nationalism?
Yep. That's my observation, and I don't think you can even deny this. I think it's generally true.
I actually think this very well could be denied or looked into. I think if you look at the average liberal and see what you measure their nationalism, you look at the average liberal Jew, look at their nationalism, it's probably pretty damn close. If you look at the average conservative,
that's Israeli nationalism. I was talking about white people.
I'm talking about American nationalism.
I'm talking about white nationalism.
Oh, so you think Jews have issue? Okay, why should Jews be white nationalists?
I'm not saying they should be white nationalists. I'm saying they shouldn't write hit pieces about white nationalists because it's racist.
You're saying people who have influence shouldn't speak against their ideological opponents. What should they do with their influence?
White nationalism is not the ideological opponent of the Jews. In fact, I would argue that if the Ben Shapiros of this world would have let America be white nationalists, they wouldn't be facing a rising generation of Arabs who hate them.
People in positions of power are going to use their power to try to influence things in their direction. Okay, so if there is a commentator who is anti-Semitic, there's a higher likelihood that a Jewish reporter is going to write a hit piece on them. If you were anti-white, most likely the person who's going to write something against you is going to be white. If your entire platform is speaking against black people, don't be surprised that black people come and write hit pieces on you. That shouldn't be hard to understand. I mean, that's literally how humans are going to function. But a lot of the things you're still attributing to Jews and what Jews do, I don't think Jews are all that different from the political group they associate themselves with. So in order to really make the case that Jewish influence in America is somehow pulling the country in the wrong direction, I think the case needs to be made that Jews are acting differently than their liberal or conservative counterparts. And I'm not sure that really is the case. I think there is one topic where this could be the case. I think Jewish conservatives have a higher rate of supporting abortion than Christian conservatives. So you could say the fact that abortion is still legal in the United States very well may be connected to Jews. But if you look on other issues, I don't really think there's a big difference in their views, and certainly not a big enough difference to make it seem like this is the direction of the country is determined by Jews. No, the direction of the country is determined by those who have the most money. Jews are overrepresented in how much wealth they own, but they are not the majority of the wealth. Not even near the majority of the wealth. The majority of the wealth, the majority of the voters are non-Jewish. And if we really want to have an accurate and holistic understanding of a political system, we need to understand how different power dynamics are playing with one another. So the Jewish question, in my opinion, or the Jews have a very, I don't want to say very small part, but they are a small part of a larger system. And to make it seem like they are the ones in control, they are the ones pulling the country in a certain direction, I just don't. I don't think there's a strong case to be made there. And
This
again,
was all obfuscation, which I've already called out, so I'm comfortable ending the discussion here. I consider that I've already laid out my arguments against this.
But I'm telling you what's missing from your argument, telling me how Jews are actually different.
No, but you're not telling me what's missing. You are trying to increase the threshold of demonstration to something I'm not even saying. I'm not saying all Jews control the whole system. I'm saying Jews are overrepresented in the things I've commented on today, which range from control over the intelligence, influence over the academia, and control over politics and geopolitics and the military. In terms of its goals for security for Israel. That is what the case I've made. And you want a stronger case that it's really about their Judaism, but it's not my case.
I'm actually not even going to push back on that. I would agree Jews are overrepresented in all the things you just mentioned, but they're not the majority representation in any of those things. They still are the minority representation. And there's no reason to believe that if Jews were to leave all positions of power tomorrow, that those who would replace them would be ideologically different from them. They would be replaced by people who are ideologically quite similar. This is the ideologies of these institutions, and they generally bring in people who hold similar ideologies. So again,
and look at who's the CEO of these institutions, and then we can establish whether these institutions are truly non-Jewish, which I don't think they are.
I mean, CEOs, if you want, we spoke about Indians earlier. If you look at a lot of the top tech companies in the world now, a lot of them have Indian CEOs.
Yeah, they are stand-ins. They're like Claudine Gay. They are in place to stand in as a race token, as a token black. And as long as they kneel to the Jews, they will stay in place. But the minute they derive a little bit from the official discourse of Israel, they will pull all of these ridiculous plagiarism allegation against her.
I mean, I didn't look into the plagiarism case, but it wouldn't surprise me if she did plagiarize. It wouldn't surprise me if she didn't. I just really don't know. But to your point, I think, again, let's talk about where we're in agreement. We're in agreement that Jews are overrepresented in certain industries. Those industries have influence. So one can conclude that Jews have a disproportionate amount of influence over U.S. politics, and I could understand why that could be concerning to people. Okay, this is area where I think we're in agreement. Where we're in disagreement is how much influence they actually have, and how much that actually has to do with them being Jewish, and how much the category of Jewish control is useful. And I think ultimately, it's not useful because it's, in my opinion, less accurate than looking at it in terms of socioeconomics and political views. And I think not only is it not accurate for that reason, I think it is also harmful because it gets us to view people in terms of ethnic groups, just creating greater division among society. So I view the framing of the conversation to be A, not so accurate, and B, harmful to society. So generally, I like to take an approach that uses the categories that are more cohesive and more accurate. And I think this is probably our biggest difference here.
All right. Thanks for the discussion.
You want to have? I'll give you the final word. As we also have 2 super chats that I'm going to address. because super chats deserve it. Thank you so much. Floodland99 goes, 29% of Nigerian diaspora hold master's degrees or PhDs compared to 11% of the U.S. population overall. Culture or race. So I think the best way to understand this is that immigration laws are tough, and they give a preference to highly educated people or people with money. So the Nigerians that are getting to immigrate to the United States are really like the elite Nigerians who are either come from money or are educated. So it's not hard to understand why they're going to have they're going to be overrepresented in that. And JF, I think you'd probably agree with that.
Yeah, there's self-selection in those samples.
Yeah.
People end up being migrants because they have a master's or a PhD,
Yeah.
so it's not valid.
Yeah. I gave the race realist argument, so obviously we agree on that. Paleo conservative also, thanks for the $5. Why do Jewish orgs support multiculturalism, open borders, and what is that word?
Miscegenation. That
I don't know
means
what that is.
race mixing.
Well, but a wall and ethno-state in Israel. So I would say liberal Jewish organizations are going to have liberal views, which involves multiculturalism, intermarrying. Open borders is an interesting one, but again, they're quite in line with liberals. I don't think there's a big difference between Jewish liberal views on this issue and a non-Jewish liberal view on this issue. And again, if we could present data that Jews have a very, very different belief on these issues, then I think that there's a stronger case to be made, but I just don't see that to be the case. And why do they support an ethno-state in Israel? Well, the reason why they support an ethno-state in Israel is because they don't see any way Israel could remain to exist if it's not an ethno-state. So they don't view multiculturalism in the United States as the death of the United States. They view that as that's what America's all about, a land for all the people. Anybody can be an American. When it comes to Israel, they don't see how that could work. They think that would be the death of the Jews. So it seems like their political ideology here is really dependent. Call it pragmatism. You could even say it's inconsistent. But I do think that different countries have different considerations, and I don't think every country needs the same policies. Can I understand why white people want the United States to remain white? For sure. Like I get it. I think no population wants to. I think there's something deep rooted in our biology and psychology where we have a major fear of demographic reversal. I think this is probably inherent to all humans. So I can understand white anxiety in the United States, seeing white people seeing themselves become a minority. They see the culture of the nation change, the language is changing. I understand that grievance very well. And I would also say that we're making a mistake by describing that grievance as racism. I think it's just giving a pejorative descriptor rather than really getting to the core of why somebody believes the way they believe. But I don't think it's entirely inconsistent to think that the United States should be multiculturalism because it could survive that way, whereas the U.S. Israel would need a Jewish majority in order to remain safe. I think you could hold both of those and not be ideologically inconsistent. Jeff, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating that you lay out the double standard and justify it. Ultimately,
you think every country should have the same exact laws, or is?
I think that every country should be self-preserving demographically, or else they will disappear.
Yeah, I'm cool with that.
It's starting to be time for us to define countries where white people's existence will be continued. And we have to have that discussion. And there's a bunch of people who have a problem with us having that discussion, and they write it pieces about us when we do.
Right. And I would agree that every population has a legitimate concern over demographic reversal and what comes with that. So I don't think there's a big disagreement there, but I don't think that there's anything. I don't think there's a double standard in looking at different countries and based on that country making a decision on certain policy. So let's say you're a Jewish American. You don't see how the United States becoming majority non-white plays is a concern to your well-being, right? So let's say you're a Jewish American. You have white friends, you have black friends. You don't really care what the demographic is. They both treat you well. You're fine with either or. In Israel, that same Jew who is comfortable with this diversity in the United States doesn't have a vision in how Jews can be a minority living on the land of Israel, Palestine, and still remain safe if they're a minority. That's perfectly reasonable position to hold. It's not a double standard. It's assessing each nation on a case by case basis.
Well,
Like
I believe that you should have a capacity to understand the other's position enough, to empathize with it enough, that you're capable of not, in a question precisely about double standards, you yourself, in response to that super chat, have phrased it as a worry for existence, a legitimate worry for existence on the side of Israel. And when it came to the white Americans, you framed it as anxiety, white anxiety, which I'm sure the wokes would love to hear that term. White anger, white anxiety. You are not so far from the woke that you claim to be against. You are pathologizing the
well,
desire to exist on the white side in a way that you wouldn't do on the Jewish side.
I acknowledge that white grievances are legitimate, and I think you can empathize with it, which is very not woke. So let's start with that. I do think so. I would call me an average Jew in this regard. I think that if and when whites become a minority in the United States, I do not think they will be killed. That's true. I do believe that if Jews become a minority in Israel, they will be killed.
What about the whites in Haiti? Do you think that whites in Haiti have been killed?
I don't know enough about that situation, but
What
if
about the whites in South Africa? Were they killed?
South Africa has a declining white population, which is, I actually use that as an example against the one state solution. Um, I'm not I I'm not going to tell an ethnic group that they have no legitimacy to be concerned about their demographics and the reversal of their demographics. That's not a position I'm going to take. I think it's very legitimate to hold that, but I could take a step back and see certain fears as more grave than others. I think that's not unreasonable. Let me try to think. Let me try to think of an example that's not the United States and not Israel and Palestine. Well, let's take apartheid South Africa. If if the white concern there would say, you know what, apartheid is bad. We need to reform the system. But having one government that represents all people, we're concerned about this happening for this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason. Therefore, we want to propose something else. I think that's legitimate. I think they should have a way to look out for their own self-interest and propose a solution that that can preserve their race or culture. I don't.
You are always looking for the kind of specific explanation for things, whereas a model that says if you are white people surrounded by a larger proportion of black people, your descendants are eventually going to die, is such a better model than caring about the everyday politics of what happened precisely at the moment in South Africa in 1990. The fact is that if you have a model that says if you're a bunch of white people and you're less than 10% of the population, you're going to be eventually completely eradicated by the blacks around you, is a model that is basically 100% correct throughout history.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
Sometimes the racial view informs you in ways that your refined political understanding might not.
if it's true that when white people are 10% of the population, they're therefore no longer safe, I think they have every reason to never want that to be the case.
Does that include the right to bomb some populations as much as Israel does in Gaza right now?
I generally speaking think that violence to the degree we're seeing in Gaza is hard to justify, and I think that we should generally look for less harmful approaches to conflict.
I agree with you on this.
Yeah.
I have to go now.
Okay,
Thanks
all
for
good.
the interview. Bye bye.
JF, thank you so much. This was great. Love to have you back on. Hopefully we don't get demonetized. Thank you.
Bye bye.
All right, I'll stay on for another few minutes, just take some audience questions. Hold on. Let's see, it's a little cool. Cool. Hend is asking, did Palestinians have a right to that fear in the 30s? Without a doubt. Not only did they have a right to that fear, they acted on that fear. In 1929, there was the Hebron massacre. You had a pogrom of Jews living in Hebron who lived peacefully with the Palestinians for many generations. And they were attacked in an instant by Palestinians who actually primarily weren't from Hebron. But this was a response to their grievance and concern about demographic reversal. Is that the right response? In my opinion, no, because we see what violence in the Israel-Palestine conflict has resulted in. Harm for both people, primarily the Palestinians. So I don't think it's the right approach, but certainly Palestinians have a right to that fear, and we saw that that fear was in many ways legitimate. Let's see, what else do we have? So Carlotte Pugh says the only racist today was Adar. Okay, well, that's interesting feedback. I'd be interested in you telling me what you think I said that is racist. I would actually expect some people to perceive me being racist because I discussed race realism and acknowledged that there's probably genetic differences between races. Many on the left would say that that's racist. So I could see that case being made, but you are coming from the anti-Jewish perspective. You're coming from the anti-Jewish perspective, so I'm interested in what you think I said that was racist. So I'm seeing some people say JF won the debate. It's interesting. I would imagine that those who agree with JF are probably going to think that he won the debate. Those who agree with me are going to think I won the debate. That's generally how it works. But I tried to present it in a way that it wouldn't be viewed as a debate, rather as just a respectful conversation, because I want to show that you can have a Jew and somebody who is concerned of the Jews having a respectful conversation. It doesn't need to be a debate with a winner or loser, but if that's your worldview, that it's zero sum and one side needs to win and the other side needs to lose, then yeah, all good. You could reach that conclusion. So Deadstar goes, you won't allow us the same homogeneous existence as you allow yourself. Again, I don't think that's the case. I think that if white people want America to be more white, then they have the right to work towards that. If Jews want Israel to be more Jewish, they can work towards that. I understand the idea of self-preservation of a people. I just, taking it from an outside perspective, I can understand, I don't think whites will be massacred if they're a minority. I do think Jews would be, right? So that's just based on what I know to be true of the world. That's the conclusion I reach. So I do have a greater concern over one than the other. So now we see is saying Jews would never allow white nations. This was the whole point of unrelenting mass immigration. Why won't they allow white nations? What is their reason for not allowing white nations? Paleoconservative Australian asks, what do I think of Antifa? Well, it's interesting because Antifa is anti-fascist, but I think they have a lot of authoritarianism in how they approach things. Like, Antifa says, of course you could punch a Nazi. Who's a Nazi? They just define a Nazi to be really anybody who supports Trump or anyone they disagree with is a Nazi. So they do something very interesting where they say something that can be taken as reasonable, punch a Nazi, but then they define Nazi in a way that's quite unreasonable and broaden the definition to include everybody who's an ideologically opponent to them. And that's really a very interesting way to just justify violence. Now, I haven't studied Antifa enough to know how much amongst them are violent and think it's okay to just blindly attack Trump supporters. So I don't want to make a blanket statement, but they do come from that camp of U.S. politics that is that many would describe as woke. I think if I could paint a distinction between Antifa and some of the other woke groups on the left, I think Antifa is a little bit more concerned with socioeconomics, which I actually that is an area of agreements between myself and them. Where the more traditional woke, for them, they actually conveniently and interestingly ignore socioeconomics and like to focus primarily on race, gender, and sexual orientation. And they make it seem like one of these three things is the greatest determiner of your outcome and how you're perceived in society. Whereas I think that socioeconomics is probably the most important determiner. So, for example, if you're a black woman from a middle-class family, you have more access to opportunity than a poor white man. But you'll never think that to be the case if you listen to the woke narrative, where they make it seem like if you're a white man, you're at the very top, doesn't matter. Socioeconomics, it's just conveniently ignored. If you're a black woman, you're all the way at the bottom. Just not accurate. So if I have an area of agreement with Antifa, it is their focus on socioeconomics, but I don't think that we should be so quick to justify violence, and I don't think we should be calling people Nazis just because we disagree with them. Let's see. We'll take a few more. If anybody else wants to give some super chats, obviously we'll prioritize them. The support really does help us, grow the channel. We do want to hire someone full time. You could be a patron or just be a member here on YouTube. Let's see some more questions. Arif is asking if I believe in the two-state solution. I would support a two-state solution if it was brought to the table and I thought it could be worked viably. I've lost belief in it over the years. I think that the majority of both populations don't want two states, and those who want to keep the land whole are more enthusiastic than those who want two states. So I think the energy is behind not splitting up the land. That being said, if we don't split up the land, what do we then do with two very different populations who have been fighting one another for over 100 years? How do they how do they live in society together under one government, one military? And that's a very challenging question to answer. So if we're going to say, do I support two states versus one state being just like a secular democracy from the river to the sea with one person, one vote, one government, I would prefer two states. But if we're talking about one state in the form of a federation, where you take the land and split it into many smaller states or cantons, kind of like the United States or Switzerland, or actually the majority of the world lives in federated systems, and then you have like a system of checks and balances, and you don't have both populations competing over demographic and political control, I think that is the ideal system. So you keep the land whole, but split it into smaller cantons, give more local autonomy, less national control, and really have a sophisticated system where the sides aren't competing for control. I think that's probably the best solution. So let's call it the 20-state solution. That's what I support. There would be 20 states. By the way, this can also solve some of the problems between the secular Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews, because there is tension there as well, competing over control over one government. Well, let the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods do what they want to do. Let the secular neighborhoods do what they want to do. Let Palestinian neighborhoods do what they want to do. I think that's probably a better system. I think one of the solutions to diversity, to diverse groups living amongst each other, is we need something that unifies us. So the belief in some commonality. So if it's the Federation of Israel and Palestine and that's the unifier, or it's just the unifier is, we both are children of Abraham and love the same land. I think that is going to be important to have a cohesive society. But we need to acknowledge that there's very different populations living on the land, not only Israelis and Palestinians, but you have Christian populations, you have Armenian ethnic groups, even amongst the Jews living there, you have many different, like smaller ethnic groups, Jews from dozens of different countries around the world, all living in Israel, different religious beliefs as well. So understanding how diverse Israel actually is, it makes sense to really give populations local autonomy so they don't feel like the state is infringing on their rights. So again, the balance between local autonomy, but also having some like commonality between us that we could all believe in, whether it's symbolism, the state, or something else. Let's see what else we got. So in which flag, I think we could keep the Israeli flag, we keep the Palestinian flag, and then we have a third flag that is, just a Federation flag. Casimir says, Adar, do you realize that this ideal system means the majority of Gazans and Judean Arab Muslims end up getting evicted, right? They will not stop aggressing. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. What ideal system? Correct. Yugoslavia failed in Bosnia and Herzegovina failed. Yeah, binational. I think binational states, especially amongst populations who have been in conflict, is generally disastrous, and that's why I don't support it. Gen X says democracy is trash. I actually don't disagree. I think Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of governance aside from all the rest or all the others. It's unclear what a better system is, but I don't think humans are particularly good decision makers. You very rarely have the smartest candidate win. You have the one that knows how to appeal to emotion win. I mean, even just let's give a clear example in the Republican primaries right now. I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy is clearly the most intelligent, the most thorough, has the best understanding of the political system, has the most is the most forward-thinking candidate by miles. If the Republican base was educated and conscious, right, conscious individuals who understood stuff and not just responding to like appeals to emotion, then Vivek should be doing much better. But that's not how it works in politics. It's who has the personality that you like, who's making appeals to emotion. I think you had a similar situation on the Democratic side with Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang was just too smart. So intelligence, character, these are things that don't seem to matter enough in democracy. It's more so how can you appeal to emotion, and that's very problematic. I mean, just look, just the fact that we very well may be. You have 350 million citizens in the United States. Joe Biden and Donald Trump, not only are they not top of the crop, they're at the bottom. These are people who shouldn't. You wouldn't hire them for a job. You wouldn't trust them to babysit your children. Why are these our two main options for running the most powerful country in the world? Clearly, there's a flawed system. If you were to just randomly pick an American, right? Let's say you were just randomly pick 35, an American age 35 or above, you very well may be picking somebody more qualified or better than both of them. But I think random picking is dumb. I think there's just a lot of really qualified people who can do an awesome job who just don't get exposure, and there's too much friction and barriers to entry for the most qualified people to do well in politics. So I'm getting more excited about benevolent AI dictatorship. Let AI process all the data, understand the needs, concerns, fears, and aspirations of all the people, and make decisions based on their ability to compute infinite amount of data, something humans can't do. Paleoconservatives asking who did I prefer to debate, JF or Adam Green? I thought I had a better conversation with JF, but I also took a slightly less combative approach with JF than I did with Adam Green, so maybe it's on me. I think JF also takes a less conspiratorial approach to how he views things. I would say JF's brand of anti-Semitism is the one that we need to be talking about, because I think it is the one that is the most common and even the easiest to understand, and easiest to engage on, right? If Jeff were to come in and say, you know, Jews control the world, they like going on all these conspiracies. The problem with the conspiracy is they're not easy to debunk, right? So I could very well have made the case that, you know, hey Jeff, there's a conspiracy that, or they say that you killed your wife, right? He can't prove that he didn't. He could say that he didn't, but he can't prove that he didn't. So that's the problem with debating conspiracies, and a lot of anti-Semitism is heavily rooted in conspiracies and Jews and all the horrible things they're doing in the world. It's much harder to have a conversation about that, because every single claim they make, you need to do extensive research on every point of the claim in order to really push back on it. I think JF's approach is really, if I'm to sum it up in a few sentences, it's Jews are overrepresented in positions of influence. Jews have a different set of values and worldview than the average American. This should be reason for concern. And I think that there's that shouldn't be a position that's hard to understand. That's not even a position that is in itself hateful. And I think understanding how people reach the conclusion that they reach is essential. In activism today, there's this approach of just labeling somebody a pejorative and then trying to cancel them. Not understanding why they view things the way they view things is a mistake. Because by canceling somebody, you don't change them. But by understanding their views and talking through them, then you do have the ability to show a different perspective. So I think JF's brand of anti-Semitism is the most common brand. I think it's the most legitimate brand, and I think it's the easiest to engage with intellectually. So that these are actually the kind of conversations I like having. Adam Green, while I wouldn't say he's super conspiratorial, he does something interesting that he's very obsessed with, like Jewish supremacy. So he's read the Talmud, and for those who don't know, the Talmud is essentially an extension to the Torah. It's a series of conversations that Jews had while they were in the diaspora. So while they were exiled from the land of Israel, they moved around Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And the Talmud is essentially writings of conversations and debates Jews had while living in Europe. Now, there's a lot of problematic things written in the Talmud, a lot of anti-Gentile, Gentiles being non-Jews, that you can find in the Talmud. Now, shouldn't be too hard to understand why. Imagine you're this oppressed ethnic group. Clearly, you're going to not like the host country that's oppressing you. So a lot of the anti-Gentile stuff in the Talmud is very much a reflection of Jewish status in Europe for really thousands of years. Now, again, this doesn't justify what's written there. It's certainly problematic text nonetheless that I think we should be able to strongly condemn. But those texts exist, and they exist there for a reason. Now, what Adam Green does is he looks at the text in the Talmud, and he says, you see, it says that Jews are meant to enslave the Gentiles. And then he'll point to media, finance, and say, and here we see Jews working to enslave the Gentiles. The problem with that argument is that the Jews who hold the power are not religious. They don't even know what the Talmud says. Many of them are atheists. So anti-Semites, what they'll often do is they'll look at texts in the Talmud and then attribute those texts to the beliefs of Jews who are atheists. So that's not really a coherent position to hold, but it's quite common. And I think that is very much at the core of a lot of Adam's arguments. JF didn't really take it in that direction. He didn't take it from a religious perspective. He viewed it more as, I think there's cultural, perhaps genetic differences that make us unaligned, and that misalignment should be reason for concern, considering how much power Jews hold. Let's see, any more questions? Why do I think, Arif asked, why do I think that Jews will be killed if they become a minority in Israel, Palestine? I think that if we look at Palestinian resistance historically, it's been primarily focused on violence. So if we compare Palestinian resistance to other conflicts, whether it's apartheid South Africa, colonialism in India, the American Civil Rights Movement, it's exceptionally violent. And the violence has been primarily targeting civilians. Now, one can make the case that this violence is justified, that when you're being occupied, that violence is the only answer. I'm not debating whether Palestinians have a right to violent resistance. I'm just acknowledging this as a fact of their resistance. It has been primarily violent. If you speak to Palestinians today, and you ask them what solution they want for the land, the majority support one state, but they do not support a binational state the way many in the West are describing it. Only around in the most recent poll, and this was after October 7th, but the most recent poll showed that only around 7% of Palestinians support a secular, democratic, binational state for both people. Over 70% of Palestinians supported one state, a Palestinian state, where Jews, what happens to Jews in the state? Now, the poll didn't show this, and so this is more anecdotal, but if you speak to Palestinians, and there's an awesome YouTube channel called the Ask Project, done by Corey Gill Schuster. He's a friend. He goes around asking Israelis and Palestinians, and again, it's anecdotal, but these interviews is one of the best ways to better understand the psyche of the people living on the land. When he asked Palestinians what should happen to Jews when Palestine wins and they have their nation, almost every single person in this video said they can stay as guests or they will need to leave. Okay. In addition to that, it's not that when we've seen violence against Jewish civilians, there's generally very little condemnation amongst the more moderate Palestinian society. They either are quiet in their disapproval or they are loud in their approval. So the combination of understanding the polling data of amongst Palestinians, isn't that cool? It just did the hell? You see that? Why did it do that? Anyways, when you look at the polling data, when you look at the history of resistance, and when you actually speak to Palestinians and ask them what they want, and when you see that violence in Palestinian society is not condemned, and you take into account that you have 100 years of fear, mistrust, and hate, and a strong sense of vengeance as well. Like it's often said Palestinians just want justice, but I think many confuse justice with vengeance. And when you actually ask them what they want, there's a lot of vengeance described in what they want. It's hard for me to see a situation where, given the chance, that there won't be backlash, where Palestinians won't take out 100 years of anger against Jews if given the chance. And I don't have much reason to believe that the broader Palestinian population will rise up and stop that from happening, because we haven't seen that happen in the past. So again, after 100 years of conflict, to have a demographic reversal when there's so much hate seems to be very likely to end in disaster. I'm not a fearmonger. I wish this wasn't the case because solving the conflict would be so much easier if it wasn't. But based on everything I know to be true, I would say almost certainly violence would occur. Um, but let's say it's not even almost certainly. Let's say it's only 10% chance that that's what happens. Don't expect Jews to, uh, on a 10% chance, risk their life, right? They're not going to do it. For Jews to consent to a solution, they need to believe to a high degree of certainty that this solution is going to keep them safe long term. So I think we need to look at solutions that really provide, um, security for both people, freedom for both people, the ability for prosperity for both people. Like we really need to take the fundamental rights of all people living on the land and find a solution that takes those rights into consideration. And I really do think a federation might very well be the way to do that. Hen goes Adar, the violence of the resistance is incomparable to the violence of the IDF. Yeah, I would say it's incomparable for a few reasons. One, the IDF has much more power, so most those killed. So the IDF kills a lot more people than Palestinians, but they're also incomparable in their intent. So if a Palestinian goes into a Jewish neighborhood and kills innocent Jews, even if children are killed, that Palestinian is considered a martyr. That Palestinian will be praised. When you had a Jewish terrorist, Baruch Goldstein, went into a mosque and shot it up, he's considered by most Israelis as a shitty human being. He's not praised. So they're not comparable for a few reasons. One, Israel has a lot more force, so they are killing more Palestinians. But they're also not comparable in the intent of the resistance. Israel generally targets military infrastructure that is heavily embedded within civilian infrastructure, and there's a strong case to be made that they're not regarding civilian life nearly enough. I wouldn't push back on that. I would agree with that statement. But they're not trying to maximize civilian death. That can't be said about Palestinian resistance, which does try to maximize civilian death. The way it's justified is that many say that there aren't any Jewish civilians. If you're living on the land, you're responsible for the actions of the state. Therefore, you're a legitimate target. But yeah, it's not comparable for a few reasons. Casimir saying federated confederate solution will fail because the other group in general does not want your peace. I think that when push comes to shove, both sides will make concessions to reach an agreement. And I think if the deal is good enough for Palestinians, then they will accept peace. I think they will come to accept the existence of the state of Israel if their life in that state or in a federation connected to that state is good enough, then they will accept it. So I don't think there's something inherent to Palestinian nationalism that says that they would not agree to any solution until all Jews are gone. I don't think that's true. I think if you talk to them now, that's what many of them say. But I think you can get to a situation where Palestinians do support or acknowledge Israel's existence as just fact of the matter. In fact, during Oslo, you had instances where over 50% of Palestinians supported a two-state solution. That's should be a promising sign, because if we had that in the past, it means we could get there and beyond in the future. We just need the right environmental conditions. Amir says, I was in love with an Israeli while living in Berlin. Oh, that's cute. Hope it works out. Paleoconservative Australian says, do you really think there is hate by Arabs in Israel? 20% of Israel are Arabs. How much violence do they do against Israelis? Barely anything. Chicago on Saturday night is way more violent. This is true. Generally speaking, Palestinian citizens of Israel are living peacefully in Israel, in harmony with Jews, and it should be a sign of what's possible. There are instances of violence during the 2021. There's an escalation of violence between Israel and Gaza, and you had an uprising of both Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel took to the streets and started attacking civilians, which to many Jewish Israelis was a sign, was a confirmation that even this minority population who we've been living in peace with can turn on us when shit hits the fan. This confirmed to many Israelis that this is possible. So if they're 50, 60, 70%, that uprising would look very, very, very different. And we're also talking about harmony between two populations that have been living as citizens for 75 years now. But it wasn't until the late 60s where, and again, I'm not justifying this. This was wrong, but Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under martial law, I believe, until the 60s. It took many generations for this cohesion to take place. But there's also, again, a difference between 20% and 50, 60, 70%. Lost in the dance floor goes, Adar is definitely Mossad. I know he's brother. Are you saying you know my brother? Do you? Where'd you meet my brother? Look, here's the thing about me being Mossad. I have no problem coming out and telling you guys I'm not Mossad. But if I was Mossad, I would say the same thing, right? So whether I'm Mossad or not, I'm not going to say that I am. Well, actually, that's not true. If I'm not Mossad, I could lie and say that I am. Okay. So it really doesn't matter what I'm saying. There's no proof either way. But I mean, look at my history. The Mossad wouldn't take me. I have too much of a problem child for them to accept me. Let's see. Why didn't early Zionists settle in Uganda where there was plenty of land and no people? All this mess would have been avoided. I don't know the considerations of the early Zionists, but I think they preferred Israel because this is the land that they are indigenous to. So they feel historical ties to the land, and I think they saw an opportunity that they took it. Zionism, Herzl Zionism was very opportunistic. It was even courageous and even naive. Like, who do they think they are coming back to land and trying to achieve statehood? It was really a bold idea that I'm sure many thought they were crazy for attempting, and it was successful in building a Jewish state. It wasn't successful in having a peaceful land. So, yeah, Margalads, we've been saying next year in Jerusalem for a very long time. That's true. So Jews have a prayer where they say next year in Jerusalem, meaning next year they'll be able to return. And when they pray, they turn towards Jerusalem, right? There's been this yearning to return for thousands of years. What is interesting, though, that Herzl and his buddies, they were very secular. Many of them were atheists, so they weren't praying towards Jerusalem because they weren't praying. But I think they still felt the connection to the land because historically that's where they come from. I will do 3 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Any super chats? we will prioritize. Much appreciated. And yeah, this was good. I hope you all enjoyed the stream. Our philosophy on this channel is really, all about reconciling between people in conflict, whether it's Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and anti-Semites, woke and anti-woke, black and white people. We'll really have any conversation, whether it's me engaging in the conversation or me moderating a conversation. I like to switch it up and do both. But we very much believe that if we have a difference in opinion or worldview, let's talk about it. Now, it is interesting is how controversial we could get without like getting strikes on YouTube. So we really pushed the limits today with what we said. Like race and IQ, problematic, Jewish control, problematic. Like these are all things that YouTube does not like. And they have an algorithm that picks up on certain keywords. So the chance of this video specifically getting demonetized, I would say, is near 100%. Will they view this video as so problematic that the channel will get a strike? I hope not, because if that's the case, then we won't be able to do many more of these. But I'll update you all. Casimir says YouTube supports anti-Semitism. I am almost certain that is not the case. I think there's probably instances where they cannot accurately identify it and they might not censor it, but to say they support it, I would need to see some evidence to that claim. Let's see. What do I think will happen with Gaza? I don't know. It's hard to know. I don't know what reports to believe. If you listen to Israel, they say it's going great and Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza, and now they're just fighting to defeat them in the south. Okay, let's say they defeat them in the south. Does that actually defeat Hamas, or are you still facing years of insurgency? How bloody is this insurgency? Can Hamas really be defeated? I'm not sure. If they are defeated, who replaces them? Unclear. So I really don't know, but it's definitely tragic what's happening, and I don't know what is going to happen, but I do hope that something does happen soon for the better. Do I think Jews all over the world should migrate to Israel? No, I think Jews should do whatever the fuck they want, just like any other people should do what they want. They should live in whatever country they feel is best for them. Well, that's if they can immigrate to that country. So no. The thing that, like, one area of Jewish privilege, if we want to call it, is that it doesn't matter where you're born, you have the right to move to another country, Israel, right? That is a privilege granted to all Jews. So if you're not happy in the country you're living in, maybe you don't have much socioeconomic opportunity, or you're scared of anti-Semitism, or you just want a fresh start to life, then yeah, move to Israel. You get a fresh start, give it a shot. Hopefully your views on the conflict are reconciliatory and you're not just adding more to the hawkish right, but more so to the you're shifting the demographics in a direction that I personally would like to see more of in Israel. But yeah, at the end of the day, live in whatever country you want. Nicki Minaj says racist. Is that to me? Am I racist again? What did I say? Who was I racist against? Adar Social Mind says, Adar, do you support Israel deporting Naturi Karta to the PLO since they support Palestine? No, I don't think you should be deported even if you're against the state. I think that is something that, well, let me be clear. The only reason you should be deported if you are against the state is if it really, really poses a threat to the survival of that state. I don't think that is true with the anti-Zionist Haredi community within Israel. I don't think they pose an existential threat. I think we do need to find ways to make them more part of Israeli society, but no, I wouldn't support deporting them. Casimir says, let's have a discussion about our different foundations. I can convince you to abandon most of your leftism. We could set up a stream where you could try to make me abandon my leftism. I'm not sure I will, because generally speaking, the positions I hold, I've thought through them. It's not just, I didn't just reach them because they're popular or cool. And that's why some of my positions aren't quite leftist. Like I said things on today's stream that many could perceive as a race realism or even racist, or some would call it a conservative position. And again, this, I'm definitely not going to say my views won't change. They certainly evolve to some extent every year, but I don't think I hold any viewpoint that hasn't been thought through. So it's hard for me to see that you're going to believe that you're going to get me to abandon leftism. Especially, I know you're a libertarian, and I've looked into libertarian political ideology quite extensively. And while it is it's compelling in many regards, I think that it's there's a naivety to it. I think it's naive to think that the private sector can solve all these problems on their own. I think there's certain things that the public sector does better than the private sector. And yeah, I don't think no government or small government or tiny government will create the best societal outcome. But yeah, we could talk about it, sure. Adar, are you a Kahanist? No, I am absolutely not a Kahanist. There's two ways to look at what a Kahanist is. A Kahanist, many just view it in terms of Kahanism, in terms of how they view Palestinians, which is we should deport Palestinians. I don't believe in deporting anybody. I think we could find a way to live peacefully together on the land. Another aspect of Kahanism is that Israel should be a Jewish theocracy. I'm a secular Jew, so I don't want any religious state to have any religious affiliation or preference. I think Israel should be a secular democracy. So no, I don't check the box of Kahanist in any way, shape, or form. Margot goes, Adar, you and your channel have given me a lot of hope these past few months. Thank you. I very much appreciate that. Hend asks, when an American Jew moves to Israel, what are the chances they end up living in an illegal settlement? I don't know, but I would probably say it's less than 10% if I were to guess. Will Israel become a pariah state? Potentially. I hope not, but I don't know, and I could see it being possible. Here's the challenging thing that people need to understand. All activism against Israel will fail if the goal is for Israel to be dismantled, right? So in order to be effective in our activism, we need goals that are achievable. Israelis will never agree to dismantle the state because they view that as the end of their survival on the land. So when Western activists or Palestinian activists are pushing for the dismantling of Israel, it doesn't matter if you're acting violently or acting peacefully, Israelis will not consent to that. So to get them to agree to a solution they don't consent to is really to just destroy them militarily. But when Israel feels in danger, they act with a level of aggression that is beyond what our enemies have capability of. So it's essentially that approach is really poking a wolf and then being upset when the wolf bites you. That really is what we're seeing with Israel time and time again. So Israel would rather become a pariah state. They would rather be isolated than be dead. So if we want to solve the conflict, we want Israel to transform, which I think Israel does need to transform. We need to give it a path to transformation that does not involve the dismantling of the state, right? So let's look at the United States. You had the American Civil Rights Movement. You didn't need to dismantle the United States for the system to change for the betterment of all people. This is how we need to look at the Israeli system. Let's transform it. Let's reform it. Israelis can get behind that. Israelis are very critical of their government. We had 8 months of weekly protests before October 7th, massive amounts of protests. These were Jewish Israelis wanting to change their government. Jews will rally to transform their nation, but they will not rally for their own destruction. So we need to have realistic goals with our activism if we want it to be effective. And that's why people like MLK, what was effective? It was very clear. His demands were very clear, and they were tenable. If we look at activism in the United States today, a lot of it's not only is it not tenable, it's like incoherent. When you look at the requests of like many, in the woke social justice movement, they're interestingly very shallow on policy. They don't have like this, here's what we want to change in the system. During the George Floyd protest, the one policy that we repeatedly heard was either defund or abolish the police, which is interesting because of how unpopular it is. The majority of Black Americans did not support defunding the police, but this was the number one policy position. Not only the number one, it was pretty much the only policy position that we heard being pushed. Now, the rest of what they're saying are these vague things like deconstruct and reconstruct. It's about ending white supremacy. It's about institutional racism. They use these vague concepts, but don't really explain them, and they don't really explain what needs to change in order for the system to change. So it's kind of like there's this vagueness to it, and I would say the only results. Now, I wouldn't say they haven't been effective, because they are effective in changing the way people think of things and speak about things, and in my opinion, to the detriment of society. But they're not going to achieve much policy change because they're not pushing for that. If you had the social justice movement say, you know what, these are the grievances of Black Americans. They are, let's say the criminal justice system treats them unfairly, or the war on drugs is destroying Black neighborhoods. So let's end the war on drugs. Cool. That's a policy position that I actually think most white and Black Americans would agree on. Whether it's how public schools are funded, can we improve that by not funding it through? So for those who don't know, in the United States, your public school is funded through property tax. But all that means is that richer neighborhoods are going to have higher property tax, more funding for schools. So in a system that claims to be, all people are created equal, you actually have a very classist system where the richer the neighborhood you live in gets more funding for their public school. This is not equal opportunity. So that's awesome policy that can be pushed for, but you just don't hear this in the discourse for racial justice, which is unfortunate. So, the pro-Palestine activists, or, the racial justice activists or trans rights activists, they're certainly effective at impacting discourse and how we view things. But if it's not grounded in real tenable change and actual policy, then it's not going to have nearly as great an impact as it could, especially with the amount of energy behind it. Floodland99 says, thanks to our chat and gotta go. Thanks for tuning in. William's asking how you can get involved. You can reach out to me. My contact information is in the description. Reach out to me either on Twitter or Instagram or email, and we'll talk. Cool. We're gonna wrap it up, guys. Thank you so much. Wait, okay. Andy Singh, Adar, read my above comment. Fine. Read your above comment, then we're signing off. Where is it? Adar, we heard from the left that South Africa would turn out great. Why can't Israel be a multi-ethnic democracy? Get over your prejudices. I'm not following, because South Africa did not turn out great. So using South Africa as an example should give Jewish Israelis more concern over a binational state, not less concern. If South Africa ended up ending apartheid and just having this beautiful, prosperous society, then you could say, look, in South Africa it worked, maybe it could work in Israel. But South Africa did not succeed. You have a declining white population. You have, I'm not going to say record level crime rates, it's not, but the crime rates are some of the highest in the world. That's not an example of a success story. It was successful in ending up apartheid, for sure. but it wasn't successful in remedying apartheid in a way that should make other nations comfortable with that solution. So to answer your question, why can't Israel be a multi-ethnic democracy? I'm not convinced it can. I think it can. I think you just need to be a federation and not one secular democratic state with one government. I think that would be a disaster. But I think, and I don't know if you were here when I mentioned this, but if it's a federated system where you take the land and split it into many smaller states or cantons and have a sophisticated system of checks and balances that populations aren't competing over demographic and political control, then I think it could certainly work. And I think that's a beautiful outcome to a conflict that has lasted way too long and taken way too many precious and innocent lives. So I'd like to see some kind of solution like that. Oh, Casimir saying it was a joke. Well, if it was a joke, why would you have me go up and reread it? Yeah. So that was sarcasm. You know, that's the thing. Sometimes it's hard to tell sarcasm in text. They have this thing where you do /S. You signify the tone. That's not really used much, but yeah. Social Mind says, do you think Israel should institutionalize secular marriages? Yeah, for sure. For sure. I want all religion out of the state. I think it should be an option. If you want to get married through the rabbinate, which is the Jewish entity that has, how do you explain the rabbinate? Yeah, it's the Jewish entity that's affiliated with the Israeli government. If you get married, you need to do it through them. If you get divorced, you do it through them. I think they could exist. And if you want to get married under the rabbinate, great. If you want to get divorced under them, great. But if you want to do it in a secular way, you can. I will say, though, it's not like if you're a Muslim living in Israel, you don't do things under the rabbinate. You do things based on Islamic law. So there is that freedom there. But yeah, I want religion out of state. I want it to be secular and let people practice their religion as freely as they want, as long as they're not infringing on the rights of others. Okay, we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you all so much. Much love. If you want to support the show, you can find how to do that in the description. And next week we're gonna have another very interesting stream next week. So hope you all tune in. Much love.